I walked in and I looked at her and I said, okay, it's over. The president accepted my resignation and we're done. And she looked at me and she goes, good. And I was shocked. And then she goes, we've always been happy and we'll always be happy. And what that did was, in an instant, it set a direction for the rest of our lives. Because instead of looking back and feeling sorry for myself, she just said, hey, we're going to move forward.
The Apostle Paul wrote, we rejoice in suffering because suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. I want to talk about that next to the last thing today, character. How do you know if you have it? How do you recognize it? How do you keep it? And I have with us today someone who has written about just that very recently, General Stanley McChrystal. Of course, retired four-star general in the United States Army, commanded our United States and international security assistance forces in Afghanistan, led the Joint Special Operations Command, including what led to the capturing of Saddam Hussein and the killing of al-Zarqawi. He has written on many things, spoken on many things. You've seen him on television and in other forums. He has a new book called On Character, Choices That Define a Life. And he's talking in this book some about his life and the things that he's learned. And some of it is a call to arms for a life of conviction and moral clarity. General McChrystal, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. And please call me Stan.
Well, I have a son who's in the Air Force, active duty right now, and spend a lot of time talking to folks in the military or who are thinking about going into the military. And I want to ask you some things about that a little bit later on. But in this new book, you talk about many things. One of those things being a big crisis that you kind of went through at one point in your life. What was that about, and what was it like?
Sure. And we all go through crises. So mine is personal, but probably not entirely different from what other people go through at times. My case was I had been in the Army for a career. I'd been commissioned officer for a little more than 34 years. I was commanding all United States and coalition forces in Afghanistan. I was four-star general. And a magazine article came out in Rolling Stone magazine, which was critical of my team. And it depicted us as being locker room mentality in terms of being dismissive of particularly the vice president, then Vice President Biden, some comments made and whatnot. Wasn't real specific, but it wasn't flattering either. It created a political controversy, particularly back in the United States, where there already was tension between Department of Defense and the new Obama administration over, the power of generals. There was this perception that there was that. And so it became significant. I flew back to the United States and accepted responsibility for the article coming out to the president and offered my resignation, which he accepted. Now, I didn't think the article was accurate or fair, but that didn't matter. What mattered is I'm the commander, I'm responsible, and an article goes on my boss's desk, which makes his job harder. And it's not my job to do that. It's my job to try to make his position easier. So I accepted responsibility, accepted it, and that ended it. And so it seems neat and clean, unless you're involved. Mm-hmm. And to go back and give people a little background, I was a son of an Army officer and the grandson of an Army officer. I'd been born in an Army hospital. At age 17, I went to West Point. All I ever wanted to be was my father, who was a career infantryman. And so I wanted to have his career, emulate his leadership and style. And I was largely able to, while I couldn't emulate him, I was able to have a similar experience over my Army career, which I absolutely loved. And so suddenly in the summer of 2010 now, when I offer my resignation and it's accepted, all of that stops suddenly, instantly. I'm in the Oval Office, and the moment President Obama accepts my resignation, I'm no longer a commander. I'm no longer a general. I'm no longer a soldier. In fact, I'm publicly disgraced figure for the length of the U.S. news cycle, which thankfully isn't really that long, but it feels that long.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in a place I never expected to be, because I always thought I could be killed in combat, or I thought I could be removed for incompetence or something like that. I never thought I'd even be mentioned on something that with the tone of this situation. And so my identity feels adrift. I had flown all night to get back from Afghanistan to the United States to go in and see the president. But I left the Oval Office, and now with my status changed completely, I drive back across Washington, D.C. to Fort McNair, where my wife was living in quarters while I was deployed. And I walked in the house, and Annie and I had been married at that point 33 years. And I walked in the door, and she had known about the article, obviously, had known I'd flown back all night, but she didn't know what was going to happen, the outcome. And I walked in, and I looked at her, and I said, okay, it's over. The president accepted my resignation, and we're done. And she looked at me, and she goes, good. And I was shocked. And then she goes, we've always been happy, and we'll always be happy. And what that did was, in an instant, it set a direction for the rest of our lives. Because instead of looking back and feeling sorry for myself, or trying to relitigate the past, or saying that I'm the aggrieved party or a victim, she just said, hey, we're going to move forward. And I joke with people that Annie lives life like she drives, with no use for the rearview mirror. And sometimes I think that's an extraordinary advantage, because what she did was, with that, she liberated us a bit to move forward. Now, I don't want to tell people it was easy and it was suddenly wiped clean and I felt great. I didn't. I felt terrible for a long time. And there's still days, 15 years on, when it's very painful to think about. But every day got easier, and I was able to go looking forward and decided what I wanted to be, strengthened by the experience I had, but not hobbled by it, not limited by it.
You know, I think that crisis, while different in the sense most people are not going to be at the middle of an international sort of vantage point, but everybody goes through that eventually. The question of, where is my identity? How wed is my identity to what I do right now? And so I think everybody goes through that. I wonder, for you, how did you know how to respond to it the way that you did? Because it seems to me that what you could have done is to say, I'm going to fight this. This is unfair. I'm going to stand up for myself and just dig in. Or you could have said, I'm just going to kind of lay low and let this die down and move on. But you chose a different path. What sorts of things in your life do you think led you to making the decision that way?
Yeah, I think that's almost the essential question. I think that you build your character, and your character is the essence of who we are. I think people will remember that Thomas Paine, when he said, reputation is what people think of us. Character is what gods and angels know of us. And it's reflected in our behavior. You know, we can pretend to have character, we can write something and say something and even believe something. But what we actually do reflects ultimately what our character is. I think my character was shaped over time. I think it's still being shaped. I think it's still incomplete at age 70. I think the the example of my parents was extraordinarily good. They never sat down and lectured us about anything. They never talked about good and evil and that sort of thing. They just lived an extraordinarily good life, both of them. And I've told people before, in the entire time, my mother died when I was 16. My father lived many more years. I never saw either of them do anything wrong. And when I say that, I never saw them take a parking place they shouldn't have. I never saw them keep extra change from a clerk who made a mistake. I never saw them do a wink and a nod and slip one over on either the system or somebody. Just, they may have done it. I never saw it. I never saw them fight. And they had 6 kids, and my dad was, deploying back and forth to Vietnam. There was probably a lot to fight about, but we never saw it. And so they were, just by example, they were one guidepost toward character. And then as I went into West Point, they were pretty overt about character, meaning they went to a lot of trouble to try to communicate character. There were statues and paintings of heroes and people that you hoped that you would try to emulate. And then there was study of it, and there was duty, honor, country, which were the basic tenets of the academy. And I was able to embrace those, although, to be honest, I embraced them as a young cadet because I was told to. And I think it took many years before I really decided what they meant to me, what duty meant to me, what honor, how I defined it, and of course, country. And so I think that you go through those formative experiences, and then you have more experiences through as you get into work life and whatnot, difficult situations, and you start to decide who you really want to be. And I know as a young officer in the Army, my leadership style would change as I was trying to find out what was right for me. You'd see a movie and you'd see this hard-bitten, person who really cracking the whip, and I'd try that for a while, and then I'd try another one, and you move along until you start to realize this is what's genuine for me, and this is what I think I'm comfortable being over time. And I think character is a lot like that. I think we make mistakes, and in the rear view mirror of those mistakes, if we recognize them as mistakes, we'll say, okay, I won't do that again. I feel guilty about that, or I'm dissatisfied with that. And therefore, you get a better sense of what to do in the future because you have that to fall back on as a template.
Did your family have any kind of a religious background or religious practice?
We did. My father was raised as a Catholic, a devout Catholic. My mother was raised as a Presbyterian. And when they got married, they decided to raise us as Episcopalians. And I think that was kind of in the middle, but it was also, there was a church near our house where we lived in Virginia. And I thought from a practical standpoint, they said, okay, this works about as well as anything. We went to church every Sunday when I was a kid, but we weren't overtly religious. We didn't talk about religion a lot. And I was not anti-religion. I just wasn't deeply religious by any means. And then later, when I married my wife, Annie, she's from a family of devout Catholics. And, that brought it back, but I'm one of those people that sort of reflexively believes in the idea of the Almighty, but I also have some discomfort with the way organized religion has been portrayed to me through my lifetime.
Well, what would one of the things that we talk about a lot here are the way that institutions right now have a crisis of credibility. Religious institutions, almost every institution in at least the survey data that I've seen, except for the military. What do you think that religious organizations and other institutions that that are sort of having this kind of a backlash to them. What can they learn from the military?
Yeah. And the military is imperfect, as you know, through your
Yeah.
son and through. I think the military has tried very hard to be apolitical. It has tried very hard, and I know it's not popular with a lot of people, but to embrace the ideas of equality and opportunity and fairness. If I were to use the word DEI, that would offend some people. But in reality, the military has tried very hard to evolve toward what they think is still protects the defense of the nation, the practical side of what the military is, but at the same time reflecting American society in a way that gives people opportunity and gives people respect. And I think the military's done pretty well at that. Not perfectly, but pretty well at doing it. And I think that other institutions often get very defensive. They will sort of man the ramparts and keep people away from change. The military tried it a few times. There was the big fight over women in combat. And it was funny because I remember watching panel discussion of generals on TV, 20 years ago. And they were asking these guys, and I had known a couple of them personally, that they were much older than me, and they were arguing this and that about, how the military would not be well served by females in combat. And then that debate continued, but it continued about a decade after women were already in combat. So the train had left the station, and those people who had experienced females in combat, who did a great job, suddenly you're watching these people get on TV and say, this will never work, and you go on. And so I think the willingness sometimes to open our eyes and embrace things is lost in big institutions, or it's hard.
I've mentioned here before that growing up in Mississippi, when I would look at the elderly people around me, the few elderly white people who had managed to stand against Jim Crow, it was usually for one of two reasons. It was either because they saw the face of it up close. They saw the Klan, they saw the hate and anger, and realized, I don't want to be that. Or they were in the United States military, and they had served with people and had a different imaginative picture of what life could be, and came home and said, what I was told just isn't true. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about, that kind of formative power of being on mission together.
Yeah, I think that was one of the greatest things about serving in the military is you were put with people from different backgrounds, economic strata, parts of the country. And my first platoon was in the late 1970s of 1970s paratroopers. And the Army was not in one of its strongest eras right after Vietnam. And so a lot of these guys were from disadvantaged backgrounds and whatnot. They didn't speak just like I did. They didn't have the same advantages I'd had, and I'm their lieutenant. But they were good people. And at the end of the day, they would do great work for you. And when you get that up close, you suddenly realize, well, wait a minute, some of this judgment that I've been served before isn't supported by my personal experience. And that happens when you go around the world as well. Mm-hmm. You go around the world and you work with Afghans or Iraqis, and you first want to say, well, these people are X. Well, one thing, you can never generalize. There's no such thing as those people are X. It's a whole bunch of individuals. And there are almost always as many good individuals in any group as there are in any group we're part of.
Why do you suppose, I think there were a lot of people who expected after September 11th, after Iraq, so forth, that there would be an anti-Muslim kind of backlash in the country that we saw a little bit of, but didn't really manifest on a large level. Do you think that's just because of the character of the American people, or was there something proactive done that kept that from really becoming the kind of problem it's been elsewhere?
Glad you raised it, because I don't think it's the character of the American people. I think we are of the character of any other people, good and bad. And I think it was some pretty good leadership. I think President Bush, after 9/11, I thought was very mature about how he depicted this. And this was uniquely difficult because the extremists of Al Qaeda used religion as an argument for what they were doing. Now, they had other reasons for what they were doing, but they used religion, so it made it so much easier. We could have defaulted to proclaiming the religion as being responsible for the activities. It wasn't. The individuals were. But the fact that they cloaked themselves in Islam made it more complicated. And that's why I think mature leadership and example was so important.
You know, one of the things that, of course, was central to that Rolling Stone piece was a critique of Vice President Biden. I'm wondering, in terms of your character, was there a temptation to have a sense of "I told you so" bitterness when you saw, for instance, the 2021 debacle in Afghanistan, that I'm sure is not what you would have recommended or have done? How did you sort of work through? I think I would be in a situation of saying, "See, this is what I was talking about at the time."
You know, not really. It was more a case because we could see this coming for quite a while. The government of Afghanistan was struggling. And then when the Doha Accords were signed and there was an agreement that American forces were going to leave on date certain, and that was before President Biden was in office. So it was already set that we were going to leave. And if he had tried to reverse that, then the Taliban would have started attacking Americans again. And a lot of Americans forget that most Americans had concluded that we needed to leave because it was the forever war and whatnot. I wish we had left a residual force. I think that could have been helpful, but I understood the political pressure not to. So I don't think there was anybody evil or stupid or whatnot making the decisions. I think that, again, there's always this temptation to point fingers at somebody else who got it wrong. And do you go back to 9/11 and say, whoever took us into Afghanistan first, they're culpable? Is it somebody else at different decision points along the way? And I never saw a single decision point that determined that outcome. In fact, I never saw stupid people or uncommitted people. My years there, I saw good people trying hard to get a good outcome. And the fact that we didn't ought to be instructive and ought to be a cautionary tale, because it was a difficult challenge, not impossible, but difficult. No, I think the biggest failure that does disappoint me is how we have treated the Afghans who partnered with us. I don't think we have been as good in our character towards our comrades as they deserved.
You know, as you're looking at the Middle East right now, as someone with more experience than almost anybody alive, what does it look like to you when you see Israel, Gaza, you see Iran and the Iran nuclear situation? I think there are some people who have this sense of, are we headed into a World War III sort of situation in the Middle East, or is this something that actually can be managed? But a lot of people can't imagine what the end point would look like. How do you see it?
Yeah, it's certainly different than any of us expected a year or a year and a half ago, because tectonic plates moved in a way that I don't think most of us anticipated. Iran turned out to be weaker. Hezbollah turned out to be weaker. Israel's been more aggressive than I think people thought in Gaza. So the conditions are different than we expected. I think that's opportunity more than it is danger right now. And I think that if we go back to 1967, for example, or even the years after, up to 73, the other Arab states around Israel were largely committed to its destruction. The states. That's not the case anymore. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, they are not committed to destroying Israel. So that dynamic is different and hopeful. Iran is in a different place than it was. It's rocked back on its heels for sure. There's always a hope that that part of the Iranian population that is not as extreme as the Ayatollah or the leaders will in fact find way to get traction and to be heard in their political environment. You know, we've been hoping for this for decades, but the reality is there is a good part of the Iranian population that would like to accept a different role in the community of nations there. And if they could rise to power, I think we could have a different dynamic there. Now, I do think there's still tremendous danger. And the tremendous danger, places like Syria, we felt so good about it a few months ago. Now, it's certainly anything but stable, so that could get worse before it gets better. And then the dynamics happening in Gaza and the West Bank, in my view, and I could argue either side of it and be both logical and passionate about it. But the reality is both the Palestinians and the Israelis have legitimate claims to land. They have legitimate defense and well-being objectives. The problem is, I think they have got to reach some modus vivendi which offers hope to both parties. For Israel, a promise of the right to exist and a hope for a continued prosperity. For the Palestinians, there's got to be a hope for a real life. And when I say a real life, that means they can't just be wards of Israel. You know, Gaza and the West Bank, controlled by essentially a foreign state, doesn't give young people the sense that of a nationality they could be a part of and that they can build up for the future. Instead, it's like an abscess that keeps growing and threatens to periodically burst out of frustration. So, in my opinion, the Abraham Accords and other dynamics offer the opportunity, without those national level friction points, to address something like Palestine and figure out, can we hit a modus vivendi that is hopeful enough for both sides that they'd be willing to then decide to build on that. I personally believe that a two-state solution is the only realistic way to give both sides the opportunity to focus on developing their own populations and lands. I know we're not close to that right now, but I think that ultimately we've got to arrive at something of that structure.
You know, the new Pope, Pope Leo, has been speaking into this issue very, very forcefully, I think. What sort of power, moral power, does a pope or a religious leader of that caliber have in dealing with these seemingly intractable military and cultural problems?
I think it's significant, and I think it's on two levels. First, a religious leader like the Pope, their personal conduct, how they are seen and heard, means an awful lot. They automatically get a bully pulpit, an opportunity to be seen up close, and therefore they can leverage that if they take it. But then also they represent an organized religion, a church, and from that they also have a foundation that they can influence a lot of people around the world. Now, what it means, though, on both levels is their personal conduct, their personal rhetoric has got to be disciplined. It's got to reflect what builds credibility. And then the organization itself, the church, must be viewed as not perfect, but not as something that is mistrusted. Mm-hmm. And so in any case, an organized religion has internal scandals or challenges and doesn't address them credibly, then it weakens that ability to have that influence.
How do you, in terms of building character, I mean, there are many things, I'm sure, as a military leader that you would have to say to yourself, am I doing the right thing morally in a way that could be gray? I mean, I think of these huge decisions, Harry Truman having to decide whether to drop the atom bomb, for instance, and all kinds of decisions like that. How do you, is there a process that you go through when you're trying to decide something like that, or is it intuitive?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I did rely on a process as well, particularly in the counter-terrorist fight. You are pulled into a murky world, which gets very, very violent and done in the shadows in many cases. There is a temptation. There's almost a gravitational pull down towards what your opponent is doing. And our opponent was cutting people's heads off, torturing people. I mean, extraordinary things. And there was a pull that says, well, I've got to do evil things to defeat evil. And you have to do difficult things, but you have to understand where on that spectrum you go from difficult into something that's wrong. And so this is where the two sides of this come out. First, there's a process. There is the law of armed conflict, which is general guidelines. But the law is not enough. You can stay within the law and do things that are wrong. And so the other part of it is it's the intuitive, it's the character or judgment-based assessments. And sometimes that's as clean as just going, boy, that doesn't feel right. What you'll find, or what I found, is it's really helpful in that case to have some outside voices. And the reason is because it's almost like if you're a young kid on the schoolyard, you get in a fight or an argument, and after you're in it for a while, you say and do things that you never thought you'd do. And so when you're in these difficult situations, it's good to have somebody who's one step away, and you can go, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think about that? And sometimes the person can look at you and go, wow, you do that? And it wakes you up. Suddenly you go, whoa, no, we wouldn't do that. But you might have found yourself drifting in that way. It's pretty easy for not just leaders, but entire organizations to do it, entire armies to do it. Look in history where armies did things that were difficult to justify afterward, but in the moment, it seemed like it was necessary.
How does one keep from overreacting to the last bad mistake? I mean, I think of the way that even with the American people, after Iraq, there seems to be a sense of a lack of patience for any kind of global leadership or intervention, and that kind of thing tends to swing back and forth. How do you keep your balance where you learn from your mistakes, but you don't overlearn from them?
Yeah, really hard on a national level, and hard for leaders as well. I think that effective leaders, military leaders, but other leaders are well served by reading history. Because if you limit yourself to your history, the things that you've experienced in recent times, and you have a bad experience in country X or war Y, you step away and say, I'm never going to war again, or I'm never going to engage with countries again. If you read enough history, you step back and say, no, those things happen. Sometimes you're going to get thrown off the horse. That doesn't mean you shouldn't ride. And so the historical sweep is valuable. The other thing is to talk through the future. You know, I had a boss who used to always say, and then what? You'd go in and say, boss, I think we should do this. And they'd go, and then what? And you'd say, and then X. And then he gets about 3 down the line, and he points out that you haven't really thought where this is going to take us. And so I think understanding in a case of what is important for the long run, you have to think about what relationship do I want to have with that country or those people over time. You know, am I going to say they're dead to me and we're never going to deal with country X again? That's just not realistic. I had a person ask me earlier today how we could talk to people, how we could negotiate or deal with people that we'd fought a war with. They were talking about the Taliban government in Afghanistan right now. And I said, well, the people you should talk to are the people you don't get along with. Because the people you do get along with, not that it's not good to talk to them, it's not necessary. The people you don't get along with are the conversations that should be had.
And I think one thing that most people don't have to deal with in a military sort of level and a global sort of level, but they do have to deal with in terms of cultivating their character. I mean, I think of the difference, for instance, of the aftermath of World War I and World War II. We look around at Germany and Japan right now, and all of the rest of Western Europe that U.S. helped to rebuild. How does one learn how to engage an opponent without humiliating that opponent in the end?
You know, it takes an awful lot, because if you think about when you start a fight against someone, the first thing you want to do to your enemy is dehumanize them. You want to call them the Huns or Japs or whatever. And that's pejorative in your mind, because it's easier to hate somebody that you simplified and made two-dimensional. And it's easier, if you're soldiers, to kill them if they are in that way in your mind. It gets back, however, to understanding that there's always this day after. And so if you say, okay, I'm going to punish the enemy because I can. I go back to General Douglas MacArthur, and he's a controversial character, but the reality is there was a great appetite at the end of World War II to prosecute the Japanese war criminals. And actually, it turned out to be an imperfect process, but one of the first cases is, do we prosecute the Emperor of Japan? Because he was overall in charge, he was the inspiration and whatnot. And after the attack on Pearl Harbor and many of the atrocities, there was this desire to punish him. MacArthur said, this is a person who commands such respect inside Japan that if we mistreat them, if we do that kind of provoking act, we're going to lose the Japanese people. The only person who can help us navigate towards a democracy is to get this person who's already got a strong following inside the country. So we have got to understand he's our best lever to get to it, the best vehicle we can use. But it takes a lot of self-control to want to do that, when in reality you want to punish.
You write about in the book the effect that fear has and responding to fear when it comes to cultivating character. What's the place of fear in a person's life in thinking this through?
Yeah. I think if we are frightened of something, we want to make it go away. And sometimes that means destroy it. Sometimes that means it gets greater distance. But it certainly means that we don't want to embrace it and to interact with it, because it carries that threat to hurt us in some way. And so fear makes us more skeptical. We're less likely to listen to people. We're less likely to talk to people that we fear. And so as a consequence, we sort of close our eyes and our ears, and we make them go away. And not knowing a group or a person increases that fear, because we are naturally scared of people who are sort of out there, you know, that race, that group, that religion, that anything. And when we get closer to them, we often find that they're only humans, they're only as tall and as smart as we are. And that can decrease the fright we have of them.
You write about the fact that when leaders abandon character, that it accelerates decay and decline. What do you see as the most urgent character crisis in American life today?
I think that it is the normalization of a lack of character. I think we've always had challenges with character. I mean, for sure, you go back at great figures in history that we still respect deeply. we will find flaws that we can say are character flaws, things they did or didn't do, and we go, wow, this is a great person, but they did this. But what we've done now is we normalize the idea that everything is okay, that I can be a scoundrel, and as long as I tell you I'm a scoundrel, then you're supposed to go, okay, that's just you. You're a scoundrel. I don't think that's right. I think there needs to be a set of norms that we agree are important for society. And you say, well, how do we do those? Are they legal? In some cases, they can't be. But we give our donations, our social media likes, we buy products, we worship celebrities, all of whom celebrate a lack of character. And we make it okay. And I've used this example with people. We now have cases where people will come on TV, and I'll pick on politicians, they're not the only people who do it. They'll look into the camera and they will lie. And they know they're lying. And the funny thing is we know they're lying.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we have this agreement that because they're politicians, that's okay. No, it's not okay. You know, if we say, well, they lie a lot, but I like their policies, that's where we've allowed erosion to occur. And I think that it starts with us as individuals because we have to demand more of ourselves. But I think it goes to our ability or our willingness to demand it of others and say, I'm not expecting you to be perfect. I'm expecting you to try to live within bounds which are acceptable, that we sort of generally all agree, a level of equity and respect for people and those things that are necessary for society to function.
What do you think is the connection between a person's character in his or her private life and public life? Should there be that sharp distinction, or are they related?
You know, I've really spent a lot of time, Russell, thinking about this. I think they're related. I don't think you can separate them. I am not, you know, a moral absolutist. I know that people make mistakes and do things, but I think that if someone is willing, for example, to lie to their spouse, why do I think they won't lie to me?
Mm-hmm.
I think that if someone, I wrote a piece on Father's Day not long ago, and the point I made is we sometimes hear stories about so-and-so is in their personal life or in their public life, they're a scoundrel, they're a criminal, they're a mob boss, but they're a good father because they go to baseball games, they're doting and whatnot. I don't think it's possible to be a good father if you're a bad person, because children view us holistically. They know what I am when I'm at the Little League game. They also know what I do, and they will, often as not, emulate that. So if our example is bad, I don't think you can have this bifurcated good and bad, that they are really good. I think the bad is actually dominant because I think it becomes the thing that actually influences.
You've had to, in your life and career, of course, cultivate people. You've had to make decisions about whether somebody has a character maybe that's not mature, but that needs to be shaped and formed, and whether somebody just does not have character. And I think a lot of people listening to this have to make that decision too. Maybe they're hiring a youth pastor for the church or so forth. How do you know if someone just needs mentoring and shaping, and if somebody just does not have the character to be in any position of leadership?
Tough call, because I believe in redemption. I believe that people can change, and I believe that with help, they often can change more easily. Having said that, there are a number of people I know that haven't changed. And so the way I do it is I use a judgment call. I try to look at all the things that person's done. If I've had the ability to interact with them, do I sense that they have the desire to be a better character, or have they just made a decision, okay, this is the standard I'm going to live? And if the latter is the case, then you just make a decision. you may still be friendly with them, you may still interact, but you're certainly not going to trust them with anything that matters. And a few cases, I've had to take people that I knew quite well and essentially sever my relationship completely with them because they've gone beyond the pale. And I no longer believe that the investment in trying to recover that is worthwhile.
There are a lot of people who said for a long time when they look at some of the problems we have in American life, well, if we just had a big crisis, the country would rally together and this would resolve itself. And of course, then we had a global pandemic that did not happen. You think about even if we were to have something along the lines of World War II, my grandfather immediately enlisted, I think, day after Pearl Harbor, and everybody he knew did. Now, we have a very small percentage of the American people who in any given time are actually serving. Do you think we ought to have a universal draft as a way of building character?
I do. And I came to this conclusion over time. Most of my career was during the volunteer army. I entered just as the draft was being stopped. And so I benefited from this very professional volunteer army. But I'm not sure that for the military, that's the best answer, because I think the military should be representative of all of our society, not just those who choose to go in. But more broadly, I'd extrapolate. I think every American should do at least a year of national service, full time. And it could be in healthcare, it could be education, it could be conservation. And they would do it with other Americans. And I think it should be with between 18 and 28. And I think that it's got to be paid a stipend because you don't want people to be dependent upon their parents to survive during the year. But I think that this would do several things. It's not the work that they would do that would matter. It's the building of an idea of citizenship, the idea that we have not only rights, but we have corresponding responsibilities. I think it's the idea that we would put people of different zip codes together. They would have a shared experience they could joke about. They may not love every day of it, but the reality is they have something that says, yeah, remember when we had to go do X for a year? And they would have a sense of ownership for the country. One of the things that I found about soldiers is they hear about heroes of other wars. But if they haven't been to war, they feel a little bit incomplete because they feel like I never did my part. And so I'm not really a full shareholder in this endeavor. Once they have, then they feel like, wait a minute, I did my part. I am equal to everybody else. I have a seat at the table. And I think that could be true for all national service. And because now we have the ability to use people of any kind of physical capability, you wouldn't be limited to people who were disabled in any way. You'd be able to give them opportunities as well. Then everybody can have this great equalizing experience. But it would have to be fair. It would have to be fairly done. It would have to be professionally done because nobody wants to send their son or daughter into something that's unsafe. You don't want young people doing something that they think is patently worthless. But we could do all that. We could build something, and I think it would change. It would heal many of the divisions in our nation over time that I find hard to think of another way to do that.
We had a question come in yesterday from a listener, young, single Christian woman, who says, my friends and I are all wanting to be married, wanting to be in relationships. We have no men around us who meet the character level or the commitment level or the discipline level that we would want in husbands and potential fathers of our children. And so what do we do? There are a lot of people who think we have kind of a crisis of men right now, that's showing itself either in kind of passivity or in a sort of predatory kind of behavior sometimes. Do you think that there is a problem right now with our men and boys particularly? And if so, what can somebody do if maybe he's a young man who says, I really haven't had any discipline or shaping and I don't know how to do it, where to start?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on this, but just my anecdotal experiences, I think we do have a problem. It's not endemic across all young men by any means, but there's a problem. And if I think back on it, it applies to slightly older men as well. But if you think about it, particularly the white male has been the bill payer for a lot of things in their minds. When civil rights came through, they gave up a little bit of privilege. When equal rights came through, they gave up a little bit of privilege. When globalization came through, they gave up some economic privilege. And the fact is, they never earned those privileges. They were just lucky that they were white males in America in an era when that was incredibly lucky for people. But those have eroded. And now many feel like, wow, I don't have as good an opportunity as people before us. Even if it's equal with everybody else, there can be that perception. And then there's this idea that we're a frontier nation, but there's not a frontier now. So we can't go out and exercise our manhood in a way that feels traditional and we see on media. And so there's this sense that I'm kind of a caged animal that can't be a full man. Now, I think you and I both know being a full man is different from that perception. But I think that there is a desire in many ways to act that out, and sort of hyper macho behavior and things like that I don't think usually are helpful. I think we got to think about it. I think you need to give young men and others a sense of purpose. They have to have something they are doing. The beauty of a thing like World War II is it gave 16 million young, mostly men, a sense of purpose. There's something they had to do. And they came back and became known as the greatest generation, not as much for what they did in the war as for what they did after. I think that if we want to help young men, we've got to give them avenues for things to build careers that matter, to contribute to society in a way that makes a difference. And I think that could be through, in some cases, our political process. That could be through the national service I talked about. It could be through organizations. There was a time when the Kiwanis and the Rotary clubs were quite strong, and they don't have that same traction anymore. But ways to actually be substantive and therefore be respected, I think is important.
If somebody was wanting to read something, they have your book on character, choices that define a life, and they're saying, General McChrystal, what are a couple other things you would recommend that we read if we want to understand character, or a film we should watch, perhaps, to see a vision of what you're talking about here?
Yeah, there are a couple things. If you want to really delve into philosophy, reading Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is good, but that's a little intimidating. And most of us don't like to sit down and read philosophy. I like to read biographies, and I would start with Abraham Lincoln. And there are countless biographies of Abraham Lincoln where you've got someone who he was capable of being a politician, and he would do maneuvers that were, tricky and not entirely honest. But we remember Abraham Lincoln for the values he epitomized. And if you read the challenges he went through, because they were very practical challenges, they were difficult, and yet he left us with this sense that you can do something really hard, but do it in a way that makes everybody better around you. So I would probably go to him. During COVID, I read the 6-volume Carl Sandburg biography of Lincoln. That's a lot of Lincoln, trust me. But it's extraordinary to spend that much time on one person's life and marinate in the hard things that they did, the things he agonized over, because we're all going to agonize over stuff. we have this danger of looking at celebrities who make wealth or fitness or sports look easy. At least they try to. And we know it's not easy for us, so we feel insufficient. It's really hard for everybody. And the question is, how do we just convince ourselves we may not be perfect in anything, but we can be good and we can make real contributions in selected things?
Last question. The first pastoral position I had was in a church that was entirely either active duty or retired military, near a military base. Best ministry experience I've ever had in my life. You have a lot of people who are in churches who have military folks, some branch of the military. They're coming in, and often they're there for a very short period of time and they leave. What advice would you give for people who are saying we really want to support and care for the military folks who come through our church?
Yeah, I think you probably experienced this and did it. Make them feel like part of the community. One of the challenges of military life is you tend to move a lot and you're always the new person and the kids are always the new kid in school. And that's hard because you're trying to get into a new classroom. The spouse is trying to find a job and it's sometimes hard as you can't really have a career if you're constantly moving. The husband's often gone a lot. And so embrace that family in a way that even though they're not going to be there forever, they'll probably be there for the length of that tour. Embrace them in a way that they aren't outsiders and don't just thank them for their service. Embrace them in a way that says, okay, you're going to be temporary, but you're going to be full members of our social community. We had that experience in some of my assignments, and it was magic because we still retain those friendships with people who were in places where we were.
General Stanley McChrystal, he is the author of the new book on character choices that define a life. You need to get it and check it out. General McChrystal, thanks for being with us.
Russell, thanks for having me.